So Mercury retrograde. Oh my gosh, it seems like everyone's quaking in their boots these days about this subject. I find it fascinating, and this may be a little bit of a controversial video, but basically I was inspired by having gotten a question from one of my students in a longer course that I have that's really towards the end of the course. And one of the instructions in the course was to look around and notice that in the universe everything is inherently meaningless, and that we create the meaning that we provide for any experience has through our own consciousness. And in fact, the universe is just an experience and just something that we have that has a dreamlike quality to it, and that the meaning that we assign to stuff is largely entirely from our own consciousness. It's just experiences as they are. And because I used the word meaningless in the instructions, she got a little bit worried and said that she actually got depressed thinking about the world as meaningless. And I actually didn't mean it in the negative connotation of the word meaningless, like it's just stupid and pointless and you shouldn't be a part of it. What I meant was that meaning is something that we bring to the table, and therefore we can be free from worrying about whether this thing or that thing means any one particular thing. It's actually an incredibly empowering place to be, and when we control the meaning of events in our lives, and when we control the meaning of events that we experience, suddenly we can have wonderful experiences of feeling like the universe is, instead of trying to get us, the universe is trying to help us, or that we can actually affect things and bring good fortune to ourselves and bring good luck to ourselves, instead of being worried about the various things going wrong and all the troubles and struggles that we have. If you realize that it's all just experience that doesn't have any inherent meaning, then suddenly you get to coast on a much more easy way of floating through life. Now, at the same time that this person asked me this question, I started noticing, both amongst my students and then just all over the place in general, that people are constantly worried about Mercury retrograde again. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what Mercury retrograde is. Mercury retrograde is an apparent backward movement of the planet Mercury. And it actually, Mercury retrograde is not something that only happens to Mercury, it happens to all the planets. And what it is we are moving, we're spinning around the sun, and because of our relative position next to Mercury or other planets, it can appear to be moving backwards. Keep that in mind. This is not something that actually happens. This is something that appears to happen. And pretty much modern astrology ignores almost all the other retrogrades, but panics about Mercury retrograde. And Christopher Warnock over at Renaissance Astrology, he's of the opinion, and I think I agree with him, that this is basically because almost all negative stuff has been removed from astrology. There's no bad news anywhere in astrology, and so Mercury retrograde gets stuck with this huge amount of responsibility as the one negative thing in the sky that can happen. The truth is that retrograde is considered to be a relatively minor affliction in astrology, and so Mercury retrograde is no different than that. It's just the planet is moving a little bit backwards, and so its energy, according to astrology, is a little bit more introverted, a little bit more in reverse. That's really all that it means, according to most astrology going back hundreds and hundreds of years. The Mercury can be in a much worse position in your chart than retrograde. It can be in its decline, it can be in its fall, it can be square with other planets that are important to you, it can be in opposition with other planets that are important to you, or it can be in houses that are detrimental because of any of those relationships. Retrograde is a temporary phenomenon. It's something that happens very frequently. So, I utilize astrology in a lot of my work, and however, I tend to, and this is a little bit, people might say it's kind of new agey, but I tend to focus on those things that are positive rather than focusing on the problems that could happen. I look for places that are going to be helpful in the work that I do. And when it can't be that way, then there's other things that I can do, including just thinking, it's going to be fine, and moving on and doing things the way that it needs to be done. Right now there are 5 planets that are retrograde. I believe it's either 4 or 5. So for some reason, Mercury is the only one that's significant, even though those other planets are all just as powerful and just as significant. The other challenge that comes up with Mercury retrograde is it literally happens 4 times a year, a lot of years. So, I mean, that's like a huge proportion of the time. Really, essentially, the whole Mercury retrograde thing goes back to, I think the furthest that is the 1970s, when someone just mentioned it in a magazine article or a newspaper column, and it's just kind of become a meme over time, in which people have just built it up more and more until it's this terrifying thing for people. But the truth is, bad things happen all the time, and good things. I've had lots of computers break down. I've had lots of cars get into wrecks during Mercury retrograde and outside of Mercury retrograde. And so have you. And you've had lots of wonderful conversations with people. You've had computers work incredibly well, and you've gotten through trips in complete safety many times during Mercury retrograde. There's a thing called confirmation bias, which is a psychological tendency that we all have that can be exploited by salespeople and by charlatans of various kinds. That once we have bought into something as being true, we're going to tend to look for those ways in which it continues to be true. So in other words, you're much more likely to think, I've had a bad conversation with someone. I bet Mercury's retrograde. And if you look it up and you see that Mercury is retrograde, you go, yep, that's Mercury retrograde. It happens to me all the time. But when you have that same bad conversation, or your car breaks down and you're like, I wonder if Mercury's retrograde, and you look it up and you see it's not retrograde, you go, oh, well, I guess it was just a regular old car accident, and it goes out of your mind. But those ones that happen during Mercury retrograde, because you've bought into the theoretical concept of it, are suddenly so much more meaningful than the ones that you ignore that happen at other times of year. So the thing to me about one of the great things about being a wizard, being a magician, is that we do have the ability to control meaning, and it's one of the ways in which magic genuinely works. When we can be in charge of what something means and how it means things to us, suddenly we are at cause over our lives and taking responsibility for things, rather than feeling like, I got to worry about all these outside forces. Now, that's not to say that you should ignore the conditions that are around you, especially if you're doing rituals that have to do with those particular energies. But like a sailor doesn't stop sailing just because the wind's blowing the wrong way. They just move the sails around and try and get things to go the way that they want them to go. That's what being a magician is, as far as I'm concerned. So, if you're worried that Mercury retrograde is going to affect you, make yourself a talisman that's a shield against the effects of Mercury retrograde. There's no reason you can't do that. And if you don't know how to make a talisman, I'll tell you, I've written a book called The New Hermetics and another book called The Book of Magic Power, both of which contain extremely easy ways of making talismans that you can assign to whatever energy you'd like to, including the energy of Mercury. And you can create something that literally just deflects that bad Mercury energy if you're really terrified of it. And if you'd like to go into even more detail, I've got a course called the 60-Day Adepthood Challenge that teaches you in detail all about these astrological forecasting techniques. It teaches you about how to make talismans that are specific to the energies of the planets, including utilizing things like the Geomancy symbols and their various sigils that you can take out of there. So you can take control of this situation, and you don't need to worry about Mercury retrograde anymore. I'd like for you all to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you're watching this now. And if you have any questions about magic or anything else in life, please feel free to ask me, and I'll try and answer them on a future broadcast. Talk to you later.